you doing? My name is Janine and I'm an upholsterer, and today I'd like to show you one of the ways that I pattern a seat cushion from scratch. Now this happens to be from a boat, but this sort of technique will apply to anything that is similar. For example, a car seat or a boat seat or a piece of furniture in your home. This will use pretty limited materials to pattern something like this. I have things to cut, things to draw, and I have some pins here that I'll be using to attach my plastic to the foam. And this is the plastic that I'll use to pattern. This is a clear 6mm vapor barrier type plastic, construction purpose, and I find it great for using on things like these because I can see through it. So if I make marks on the foam, I'll be able to see through the plastic to draw those marks onto the plastic. Alternatively, if you don't have that type of material, you can use vinyl or paper or anything else. You just won't be able to see through it. So it'll be a bit more of a challenge to mark your marks if you have them on the foam onto the vinyl or the paper, whatever you might be using. So this currently is 2 pieces. This is from a boat. It's a fairly new boat. And this is what the old cover looks like. I will be simplifying this, but this is a fairly simple seam to add if you were doing this as well. So this is what the old cover looked like. The owner of this wants to eliminate this seam because it's sort of a step in the boat when they get in and out. They're always stepping on this, and because of that, it rips. Might be difficult to see here, but this whole seam basically is coming apart, and we don't want that. So what we will do in this situation is I will glue these pieces of foam together to make one unit, and then it will have one face and one band. So it'll be quite simplified, but it won't be able to rip here anymore. So they can stand on this, they can jump on this, it will be fine. So step 1. This cushion has sort of an up and down band. So fortunately, because of that, I'll be able to just measure this band and make an oversized one to sew onto my face. However, if your cushion has an angled piece here, you would pattern these sides similar to how I'm going to pattern this face. So I'll jump right into the face patterning. Now the main thing to consider when you're doing something like this is if your cushion is contoured in any way, you'll see it in the plastic. So it will wrinkle and buckle and it won't stretch or it'll float. It'll do weird things if it's not flat. This one happens to be flat. So this is a pretty straightforward basic pattern. And I will be using my pins here. I basically just shove these in to hold the plastic down so it doesn't slide around on me when I'm tracing it. That should be good to go. It should be good. I think I'll be able to draw this without it sliding around anywhere. So that's where I bring out my Sharpie. And all I'm doing is tracing the edge of the foam. Basically just these sharp edges. This one doesn't work very good. That's better. When I put this plastic pattern on the table to cut it out, basically to trace onto my vinyl, I will use a straight edge and straighten up these lines. So my important lines are the very corners. I want to make sure those are as accurate as possible. And the rest I'll clean up on the table. And also, because I'll be gluing this piece to the big piece, it sticks out right now. It's not very accurate to pattern, but it will be flush once it's glued. So I'm not going to draw that line. A very important step when using something like this plastic, because it looks similar on both sides if you accidentally flip it upside down, right? Out or top or something to let you know what the outside versus the inside of the pattern is. And I draw arrows on stuff. I normally put an arrow facing forward or an arrow facing up. So this is basically all I would do for this cushion. It's pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. So what I'll do now is I just make sure I have all of my corners drawn, and I'll take the pattern off. I can move the cushion and I'll clean up the lines on the edges. Something to keep in mind when doing upholstery like this is not a brand new piece of foam on this cushion. So after, using it a few times, things will sort of shift and tweak a little bit in shape. So if I put a square on all these corners, they're not square anymore, but it does fit in a hole in the boat that has the rest of the seats wearing similarly. So if I spend a lot of time and really clean up and square up these corners and measure everything to fit more of the base measurement, for example, rather than the squished foam measurement in shape, when I put the cover on, it might fit a little bit twisted and tweaked. With that being said, I want to make sure these lines and seams are all straight and not angled to fit with the foam. And if it was too angled, I would have to either modify or replace the foam. But in this case, the lines all seem relatively straight. They're all just kind of, tweaked a little bit. So it looks a bit strange, but it will fit on the cushion. This cover will fit on the cushion in the boat the way that it's supposed to and the way it's kind of worn in. If you were redoing all of the seats in the boat, you could definitely either replace or modify the foam and square up a lot of these corners to make them all nice and crisp and clean. But when you're doing just one cushion at a time, I like to make sure that it fits sort of in the boat and doesn't look like it was tampered with, and it kind of blends in with everything else. So with that being said, if I measure this right now diagonally, it would not measure what you would hope at all. But that's not what I'm going for. I'm going for stealth, blending in, if you will. So these lines, I'll make them crisp here. I have two options. One option is I can draw this Sharpie line right now where I want to sew it or where I want to cut it. And by that I mean adding seam allowance or not. Sometimes when you're tracing plastic onto any type of vinyl or fabric, sometimes it's really easy to trace the edge of the plastic, but sometimes it's a bit awkward and the plastic gets in the way of your chalk mark or your pen mark or your pencil mark, whatever you're using to draw on your material. So I will cut this, I will draw it first where I want the seam. So I'll draw these crisp lines on my stitch. And then when I put this piece of plastic on my material that I'll be using on the seat, I will add my seam allowance at that point. And it's important to have either a system or notes, like I'll often do a plus SA, which means add seam allowance. That way I remember oh right, I was going to add my seam allowance. Because if you forget or you add it double, you'll notice it when you go to install it. So for this cushion, I'm going to draw these sew lines, and I'll cut on those lines, and then I'll add my seam allowance on the vinyl for the real thing. Hopefully that makes sense. And if I have multiple lines on a pattern, for example, I have two kind of side by side, I'll just draw an arrow to the one that I'm using to make sure I cut it on that right line instead of the one that might be crooked or cattywampus. Is that a word? Is that a real word? Okay, time to cut. What do they say? Measure twice, cut once? This is the measuring twice. I'll double check my pattern on my seat to make sure it fits okay. So if I were to take this today and add my seam allowance onto a piece of vinyl that I'll be using to upholster this, I think I would be happy with this shape. Although I will be rounding these corners a little bit. And to do that, I will trace something round. For example, I'll use my pin tin and I'll just put it on here and draw those corners. I'll pick a radius that works right with the cushion. Sometimes they vary front to back, but I'll make it round, basically. And this band will have a seam. I think I'll put a seam on the back in the middle because you don't see that back at all. Another option would be to put a seam on each corner. But I will be double stitching this face to the band, and double stitching over a seam isn't bad, but double stitching over a seam in a corner times 2, if you don't have to do it, it'll be a little bit smoother in the middle. If this was angled, I would do the same thing that I did with the face on the side. And I would use my pins, and I would pin this. I would trim the excess off so it, fits nicely as if it were upholstered. And I always make notes. If I'm needing to add 1 inch, for example, onto the bottom for stapling, I'll make a note plus 1 inch, with an arrow to what edge. I would do the same thing for my seam allowance. I would probably draw this edge and add my seam allowance, whatever it may be. Because I'm double stitching this one will be a heavy 3/8 seam allowance, so I have enough meat to wrap my seam allowance back and sew it again. And for the seam, I would draw a Sharpie line right along this edge with some randomly spaced line-up marks for sewing the two pieces together. And that will give me a guide as I work my way around the cushion to line up those two pieces. What else we got here? If you were patterning this, I would do the same also. I would put some line-up marks on this line here in between these two pieces of foam, and I would pattern this piece, and I would pattern this piece, so then I would have the face, and this top, and this front, and then this band. It's all basically the same technique. You just put the plastic on, trace where you want your seams, and most importantly, make notes of things you might need to refer to later, like seam allowance or staple excess, and things like that. You can also add notes like if you're putting piping here or a French seam here. You can write all of that on your pattern, no problem. Also, I will be adding sew foam to this piece, as well as sew foam to my band on the side. So I want to make sure that this pattern doesn't end up being too small. So I will definitely add 100% of my seam allowance. Sometimes when I'm patterning something like this, if it has no sew foam, and I want it to be a fairly tight-fitting cover, I will add a really small seam allowance in my pattern, and then I will sew a slightly bigger seam allowance, overall making it fit a little bit tighter if it's something that I'm building out of vinyl, for example, because it does have some stretch to it. But in this case, it will be vinyl, but it will have sew foam on it. And because we're gluing this seam and the foam back together here, there will also be another layer of foam added to the top to help smooth this out so you don't see any lumps in the foam that would, indicate this used to be different in the past. So based on this, I will take my pattern and I will put it on my vinyl, trace it. I'll measure my band in this case, or otherwise I would have my patterns for all of these. I would put those on my material, and at that point, I just cut it and sew it together, and it's pretty straightforward. But this is a way that I like to pattern. I can see what I'm doing, and I can make a lot of notes on it. But I urge you, don't forget, if you're doing this, don't forget to write your out, or your in, or whatever direction you might want. And that will make things make sense. Also, when you're laying it out on your material, if you're using something that has a sort of a pattern in the grain of the vinyl, for example, or if you were using striped fabric, I hate using striped fabric, but if you were using something like that, you would want a lot of these marks on here so you can put your pieces on your material and get them all facing the right direction. Sometimes there's a bit of a difference in sheen. If you flip something around 180 degrees, it will look slightly different in color. So when you have all your arrows facing the same way, that will help avoid the mistake of getting things all weird. So hopefully that makes sense. We do this quite a bit if our pattern that we're using from the original cover is no good. Like, for example, this one is being simplified, so I can't use that pattern. Or if it was too damaged and you couldn't, lay things out properly and trace them cleanly, then this is certainly a super easy way that you can get a nice, crisp, clean pattern to make your upholstery beautiful. Hopefully you found it somewhat educational, perhaps, entertaining, I don't know. Hopefully you enjoyed it, is what I'm trying to say. And maybe next time I'll sew them together. That could be fun. Thanks for watching.